All right, so the final type of machine learning model that we are going to talk about are neural networks. And I'm sure all of you have heard of neural networks because there's a lot of hype on them, and they always sound very sexy because everyone thinks that it's so cool, right? That we have an algorithm that models what a human brain is like, all right? Now, so as I mentioned, neural networks have gotten a lot of hype in recent years. In many areas, they have outperformed a lot of the traditional machine learning methodologies, okay? So for example, when we talk about the ImageNet competitions, remember the competition where people have an algorithm look at an image and classify whether this image is that of a cat or a dog. In that competition in particular, neural networks have performed extremely well. Right. Now, also, of course, when we hear things like AlphaGo or more recently AlphaFold, the algorithm to predict protein structure, all those are based on neural networks. Okay. Now, what you may not realize though is that neural networks has actually been around for a very long time, right? So the neural network as a concept has been developed since the 1950s, 60s, okay? So it is not a recent development, okay? So there have been a lot of recent advances in neural networks, but as a fundamental concept, it has actually been around for very long. The problem though has always been that to train a neural network, you require a lot more data than your other machine learning models, okay? So, and it is only in recent years when we start getting, when all of us start posting our lives online and we have like millions and millions of images and data points to start building machine learning models on, that neural networks actually start becoming useful, right? Before that, if you have like 100 data points, neural networks in general are not the tool that you will go to, okay? So what is a neural network, okay? A neural network is basically a learning algorithm that is very loosely based on the structure of the brain, okay? And I say that loosely, okay? In the sense that it is really more or less like a concatenation of linear models rather than really how the brain works, all right? So there are a number of terms that you will hear about artificial neural networks. Sometimes you will hear the term called multi-layer perceptron. That actually refers to an feedforward neural network, okay? So in Scikit-learn, this is basically the term for it, MLP, all right? And the reason why neural networks have gotten so much attention was really due to this theorem called the universal approximation theorem. The universal approximation theorem just says that a feedforward neural network with a single hidden layer containing a finite number of neurons can approximate continuous function under any Mao assumptions of the activation function. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what activation function is, but by and large it just means that given a sufficient number of neurons, and just a simple feedforward neural network can essentially approximate any functional relationship, right? So that's actually a very powerful concept. It just means that it doesn't really matter what the mapping between the input and output is. If there is a functional relationship between the two, a neural network will be able to model that relationship. Whether you have enough training data to actually get the neural network to be trained to model that function, that's a separate question. But hypothetically, it is possible, okay? So this is basically what a neural network looks like. You probably have seen this a gazillion times, all right? So you have basically your input layers, okay? And each of these circles are what are called neurons in the neural network terminology, right? And for a densely connected artificial neural network, you basically have these intermediate layers, which are called hidden layers, and finally you have an output layer, right? So basically, at each of these neurons, you basically apply a series, a set of functions to this, each of these inputs, and then the output of this, each neuron then gets mapped into the next layer of neurons, and then followed by another layer of neurons, and followed by however number of hidden layers that you want, and then finally that gets mapped into an output layer. Okay, so whenever you are deciding on training the designing a neural network, the architecture of this neural network is actually the most important factor. So in other words, what's the total number of neurons you want to use for each of the hidden layers, and how deep you want the layers to be. Okay. Now, what happens in each of those neurons? It is actually surprisingly simple. Okay, it is nothing complex at all. Each of these neurons basically is a linear function of the inputs. Okay, so basically each output of the neuron is just some linear function of your x1, x2, x3, which is your inputs. Okay. Now, in each of the neurons, you also have an activation function. So this is obviously just a simple linear relationship, but then that is there is an activation function that is applied on the total result of that linear function of your input. Okay, so this activation function, there is actually multiple choices, right? The common choices of the activation function includes what is called the rectified linear unit. You can also use sigmoid functions. There's a function called soft plus as well. In general, you can test out different activation functions and see which ones perform better for the problem that you have at hand. My experience is that usually it's not too sensitive to it, but in some problems it actually has an impact on the prediction performance. Okay. Now, why is this called a neuron, right? So it turns out this is actually, roughly speaking, the way that our brain actually learns new information, right? What we have is basically an input. So let's say we actually have a stimuli from our external environment. Okay, that's our input, and that stimuli gets passed as electric pulses to the neurons in our brain, and only if the stimuli is above a certain level, that stimuli then gets passed on to the next neuron. Okay, and as you keep passing stimuli through our brains, basically what our neurons then begin to do is that it learns the relationship, right? Like for example, when we are young, we touch a hot thing for the first time, our brain decides that, oh, this is a fire and I shouldn't be touching hot stuff, right? So that's basically how that process works. And this activation function essentially simulates that process, that you actually need a signal of a certain minimum magnitude in order for that signal to be passed on to the next neuron. Okay? So these are what the activation functions look like. So I'm going to start with the ReLU, which is the rectified linear unit, because this is the easiest to understand. So the rectified linear unit just simply says that when x is greater than 0, I'm going to just pass on the value of the output directly. When x is less than 0, the signal that I pass on is 0. In other words, there's no signal. Okay? So you can imagine this is basically simulating how a threshold works, right? In essence, unless the signal is above 0, we don't actually pass on the signal, right? So the soft plus is alternative activation function. The advantage of the soft plus is that it's of course continuous and differentiable. So, but by and large, it also has the same effect. When the signal is below a certain threshold, it is going to go to close to 0. When it is above a certain threshold, then the signal gets passed on without any modification or very little modification. Okay, so this is basically what a soft plus looks like. And of course, the other one that is very commonly used is what is called a sigmoid function, which actually has this form over here. Okay. All right. So in a neural network, what you are doing is that you are trying to find what these coefficients are. Okay. What this alpha 0m and alpha m transpose are. Okay. So in other words, it is sort of like fitting your linear regression model. You want to know what your coefficients of your linear regression models are, except that now you have one linear model for every single neuron. Okay? So in other words, you have a lot more coefficients, right? So it is not just one linear function, but rather the combination of a lot of linear functions, right? So these are called model weights. So which are the alphas in your linear functions, and they are fitted by what is called a backpropagation algorithm. So this is essentially a form of gradient descent. This was developed by Geoffrey Hinton. I believe it was in the 1980s or so. So again, this was a big breakthrough, right? Before that, people had no real idea how am I supposed to fit my neural network, all right? I can hypothetically think of a neural network as a structure. I can prove that they can model any function, but I don't actually know how to fit a neural network. So the development of backpropagation was actually one of the reasons why neural networks suddenly became more and more interesting, right? So similar to all your other machine learning problems, typically for neural networks, you use a square error for regression, or you can also use your cross entropy or square error for your classification as well. Okay, and to avoid overfitting, similar to all your other types of models, linear models, tree models, you can use regularization, right? And in this case, basically the way that you regularize is that you use you do the sum of the model weights, and you apply again a penalty term to make sure that you don't overfit your neural network. Okay. Now, what are some of the parameter decisions you have to make when you are choosing or fitting a neural network, right? So the first obvious one is, of course, your number of hidden units and layers, right? So how do you know how many layers do you need? Do you need one single hidden layer, two hidden layers, 10 hidden layers? And how many units are in each, how many neurons are in each layer? 10, 20, 30? Okay, so you do need to decide on these numbers, but by and large, it is generally best practice to err on the side of having too much hidden layers rather than too few, all right? So especially if you know that the relationship is highly nonlinear, you do need that flexibility in your neural network to model those nonlinear relationships, all right? Once you actually fit the model, you can, of course, then shrink some of the extra weights to zero using regularization. So this is similar to the way that you do cost complexity pruning for your trees. You can fit a tree to a very deep depth, and then you do pruning to basically get a regularized tree that will perform better, that will generalize better on your unseen data, okay? And you can do a similar thing with your neural network. In fitting neural networks, there's something called the learning rate. This is a key control parameter that you actually have to tweak, okay? Usually the defaults are somewhat okay, but you might want to play around with it. Basically what the learning rate controls is basically the rate of gradient descent, right? If you have a very high learning rate, essentially what this means is that you go down the gradient very quickly. It reduces the training time, but you also can have the effect of reducing accuracy. Okay, so what the state of the art is actually an adaptive learning rate, right? So there's actually, if you look at the implementations in Scikit-learn as well as other packages, they usually have a adaptive learning rate where they basically start with a very high learning rate to get quickly to somewhere close to your minimum, and then they slow down the learning rate to improve the accuracy, okay? So the error function is non-convex, and it also contains multiple minima. So the it's not deterministic, okay? So it's not like your simple linear regression where you just invert matrices and you get a deterministic answer for the optimal coefficients. Here, depending on what your initialization of the weights is, you can get different results, right? So typically what you will do is that you will start with multiple random starting configurations, and then you choose a solution with the lowest penalized error, okay? So that's basically one of the issues that you have to be aware of. And you can also, of course, take an ensemble of neural networks as well. In other words, you average your predictions across multiple neural networks models to actually get a prediction, okay? All right, so there are a few software packages for neural networks. Scikit-learn actually already has a basic implementation, and that's the one that I'm going to show you an example of. However, if you are into very serious work with neural networks, okay, if you want to apply them in your own research and you have data sets that are much, much larger than what we have in our course, you should be aware that there are other packages that are more targeted at for neural network models, okay? So the first one is of course TensorFlow, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. This is an open source package by Google. It is very powerful, very efficient. So if you have powerful GPUs that you use to feed your neural networks, this TensorFlow is actually a good choice. If you actually choose to use TensorFlow, you can use the Keras package, which actually provides you with a high-level interface into the TensorFlow underlying code. The problem with TensorFlow is, of course, that in terms of user-friendliness, it is not as user-friendly, okay? It is very powerful. There are a lot of things you can tweak to optimize your models, but there's a steep learning curve associated with it, okay? The other package that a lot of people use, and especially in the scientific community, actually more people uses that, is PyTorch, right? So PyTorch is developed by Facebook, and I would say the learning curve is slightly less steep than TensorFlow, and a lot of people at least in the material science community, are actually working with PyTorch, but also there are people working with TensorFlow as well, right? So let me just show you how you go about constructing a neural network with Scikit-learn and TensorFlow 2.0. So with Scikit-learn, it's actually very simple. There's a neural network package, and you have your basic neural network models. One is called an MLP regressor. There's also something called MLP classifier. So those are for regression and classification, as their name implies. You have your inputs, your arguments. The one that is definitely needed is your hidden layer sizes. So basically this tells the code how many neurons are supposed to be in each layer. So here I have two hidden layers. One layer has 5 neurons and the other hidden layer has 3 neurons, okay? Because this is a gradient descent, you can set what's the maximum number of iterations you want to converge the MLP regressor. There's also a learning rate that you can set. There is also the algorithm for the adaptive learning rate that you can set, okay? And of course, the alpha parameter is your regularization parameter for your neural network. Otherwise, it is basically the same as all the other codes that you have used so far. You basically call a fit. You have the score function. You have the predict functions. It's all the same, okay? One thing to note about neural network is that similar to all, most of the other models, especially the regularized models, scaling of your inputs is definitely necessary, okay? So make sure you do your scaling. Now, if you want to do the same thing in TensorFlow, this is basically how you actually construct the TensorFlow model. So you basically need to specify an input layer, which tells them how many neurons are in the input layer. Then you actually construct your first hidden layer which has 5 neurons, second hidden layer with 3 neurons, and here we specify the activation function is the ReLU function, and you basically need to integrate each of these layers together to basically form a full model. Okay, so as you can see, there's a lot more code associated with how do you construct the model. Okay, but there's also a lot more customization options, right? You can play around with whether you want this to be a dense layer. Dense layer just means that every single input is connected to every single output is connected to every single input, or you can actually choose some other different kinds of hidden layer connections, and you can also customize things like the optimizer, which determines the adaptive algorithm for the learning rate, and various optimizations involved. There are also other optimizations for things like how to make the model faster and that sort of thing. Okay, so I'm going to just show you the example, but I'm not going to. I'm not expecting that you are going to use TensorFlow for your lab number 3. Okay, so for those of you who want to play around with the neural networks for your lab number 3, I think it suffices that you just use the Scikit-learn version of the neural network. Okay. All right. Now, so that covers the very basic neural network, right? Which is what we call a feed-forward neural network, which you just basically have inputs go to hidden layer go to the next hidden layer, and then it goes to the output layer. Now, there are other kinds of neural networks, all right? So we are not actually going to go into detail for any of them, simply because there are entire data science courses just dedicated to neural networks, right? So we just want to cover, we just want to make you aware that there are variations of neural networks that you might want to use for certain classes of problems. So for example, there's what is called convolutional neural networks. So convolutional neural networks basically use convolutional operations to achieve translational invariance. Okay. Now, this is actually very important in one specific application that we have talked about before, which is image processing and image recognition. If you can imagine, if you have a picture of a cat, it doesn't matter whether your cat is sitting in the bottom left corner or the top right corner, right? It is still an image of a cat, right? So that's why CNNs are actually very useful for representing that particular problem. There's translation invariance built into the model itself. Another type of problem where we, in material science, where we actually have this feature is basically in modeling crystals. So as you can imagine, when we actually model a crystal structure, if we translate by a lattice vector, we should basically be getting exactly the same properties of our crystal. It actually doesn't matter how translating the crystal actually doesn't have any effect on the properties of the crystal. So we can actually use CNN to actually build in that property of a crystal structure into our model. Okay. There is also another type of neural networks called recurrent neural networks. Instead of a bidirectional graph, we basically now have a connection between nodes with a directed graph that forms a temporal sequence, right? So this is really meant to model time-based effects. Okay, so it has temporal and dynamic behavior built into it. So one application that you can think about that we use this is handwriting recognition, right? Because it actually matters how we start our stroke and end our stroke, right? For our for handwriting, right? So this is recurrent NNs are basically used in such application. The other application that it is used for is speech recognition, right? So if you look at how, for example, these days you have your Zoom meetings and they have auto subtitles, right? You notice that when they actually do the predict what you actually said, sometimes they autocorrect the previous words, right? So there is actually a temporal dependence on speech. So for example, if I say there's a relationship between the words that have come before and the words that come after. So the English, there's some relationships built into the English grammar and vocabulary, right? So all these can be modeled using recurrent neural networks. All right, so I just want to show you a few examples where neural networks are used in material science. So one of the most successful examples of the application of neural networks in material science is in interatomic potentials. There's actually a class of interatomic potentials called neural network potentials, or NNPs, right? So the way that this works is that they use atom symmetry functions to represent each of the atomic local environments, right? So atom-centered symmetry functions are basically just functions that represent the local environment around each atom in terms of things like the radial function, so how's the distribution of the distances between the atoms, and also the angular arrangement of atoms around each atom, right? So you don't actually need to worry too much about the specifics of the functions themselves, but just as a concept, right? When you want to describe the local environment around each atom, you need to know what are the distances between them and what are the angles that are formed by the atoms together, right? And in the NNP, basically what you have is fully connected artificial neural networks mapping essentially the atom-centered symmetry functions to the potential energy surface. In other words, the energy and forces on each atom, right? And once you actually fit them, you can then use this to run simulations by predicting energies and forces for any arbitrary arrangement of atoms, right? And this has been very successful, okay? So it is, today we can actually fill NNPs that are very close to the accuracy that you get with your ab initio methods, but yet is much cheaper to run. So you can actually simulate much larger systems and also run for much longer simulation times, right? So for example, for those of you who have done your, I think it's NANO181, which is your simulation course, is that it? Yeah. Right? Yeah. So you did LAMPS? You are doing LAMPS right now. Yeah. What potential did they ask you to use? Leonard Jones? Yeah. So Leonard Jones is a crude form of interatomic potential. It basically describes what's the force on each atom or energy on each atom using some very basic functional relationship. So what this does is basically it replaces that Leonard Jones with a much more accurate description, right? So Leonard Jones is fine for certain types of problems, right? And for learning purposes, it's actually good because it's very cheap and fast. So you learn how to run the MD simulations and everything. But once you get to research purposes where you really need much more accurate results or you are dealing with much more complex systems, then this is where machine learning has had a very important impact, where we now are able to fit potentials that are much more accurate to much more complex systems in a much more systematic way than what we have done before, okay? All right. So this is one example. So this is a neural network potential for silicon. So as I mentioned, you basically map every single atom to some set of symmetry functions, and then each of those, you basically have an artificial neural network, and each of those new artificial neural networks then predict the energies on each atom, and then you sum the energies on the atoms to basically get your total energy, right? What this basically just shows is this is the radial distribution function of silicon, amorphous silicon, and they basically run the MD simulations on silicon, and then they show that if you do it with DFT versus you do it with neural networks, basically you get almost the same result, while if you use any of the traditional potentials that people have built for silicon, they are much less accurate. Okay, and silicon is really almost the simplest example you can do, right? So there are much more sophisticated NNPs. So this is actually a follow-on work where basically they did it for lithium silicon. So for those of you who do not know, silicon is actually a highly promising anode material for lithium-ion batteries. So people are always very interested in what happens when you put lithium into silicon, right? What is the phase diagram of that, and how does that determine the voltage or intercalation behavior of lithium, right? And so using NNPs, basically in this work they study the phase diagram of the lithium silicon system and calculate what sort of phases would you expect to form at different stages of the lithiation process, okay? This is actually work from my group where we basically use NNP to basically predict the formation energies of garnets and perovskites using a very simple model. Okay, so this is actually deceptively simple. We basically just have the electronegativity and ionic radius of each species in the garnet or perovskite, and then we have an artificial neural network to fit the formation energies, and we show that actually just with these two parameters for each atom, we can actually get a very good prediction of the formation energies using an artificial neural network. Okay. This is another work that is from our department. So this is work from Professor Ken Vecchio's group, where they basically use CNNs to determine the crystal symmetry from electron diffraction patterns, right? So this work is actually fairly recent. I think it was published in 2020 or 2021, I can't remember. But yeah, so basically they have this input electron diffraction image, and they train a CNN to basically predict which of this crystal structure does this electron diffraction pattern represent, okay? Now, and the accuracy is very good, right? It's above 90%. So actually in previous years, we actually have a modified version of this question as our final lab for the grad students. So we, instead of electron diffraction patterns, we actually gave X-ray diffraction patterns instead. And the results were also pretty good from that Kaggle competition, right? All right, with that, that's all for neural networks.